This is Audible.
Macmillan Audio presents Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. Read for you by the authors.
Preface. So there I was. Plenty of glorified war stories start like that. In the SEAL teams, we make fun of those who tell embellished tales about themselves. A typical war story, told in jest about something a SEAL did, usually begins like this. So no shit, there I was, knee-deep in grenade pens. This book isn't meant to be an individual's glorified war story. As SEALs, we operate as a team of high-caliber, multi-talented individuals who have been through perhaps the toughest military training and most rigorous screening process anywhere. But in the SEAL program, it is all about the team. The sum is far greater than the parts. We refer to our professional warfare community simply as the teams. We call ourselves team guys. This book describes SEAL combat operations and training through our eyes, from our individual perspectives, and applies our experience to leadership and management practices in the business world. Yet our SEAL operations were not about us as individuals. Our stories are of the SEAL platoon and task unit we were lucky enough to lead. Chris Kyle, the SEAL sniper and author of the bestseller American Sniper, which inspired the movie, was one member of that platoon and task unit, Charlie Platoon's lead sniper and point man in Task Unit Bruiser. He played a part in the combat examples in this book, as did a host of other teammates who, though deserving of recognition, remain out of the spotlight. Far from being ours alone, the war stories in this book are of the brothers and leaders we served with and fought alongside, the team. The combat scenarios describe how we confronted obstacles as a team and overcame those challenges together. After all, there can be no leadership where there is no team.
Between the Vietnam War and the global war on terrorism, the U.S. military experienced a 30-year span of virtually no sustained combat operations, with the exception of a few flashes of conflict. Grenada, Panama, Kuwait, Somalia. Only a handful of U.S. military leaders had any real, substantial combat experience. In the SEAL teams, these were the dry years. As those who served in heavy combat situations in the jungles of Vietnam retired, their combat leadership lessons faded. All that changed on September 11th, 2001, when the horrific terrorist attacks on the U.S. homeland launched America once again into sustained conflict. More than a decade of continuous war and tough combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan gave birth to a new generation of leaders in the ranks of America's fighting forces. These leaders were forged not in classrooms through hypothetical training and theory, but through practical, hands-on experience on the front lines of war, the front echelon. Leadership theories were tested in combat, hypotheses put through trials of fire. Across the ranks of the U.S. military services, forgotten wartime lessons were rewritten in blood. Some leadership principles developed in training proved ineffective in actual combat. Thus, effective leadership skills were honed, while those that proved impractical were discarded, spawning a new generation of combat leaders from across the broad ranks of all U.S. military services: Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, and those of our allies. The U.S. Navy SEAL teams were at the forefront of this leadership transformation, emerging from the triumphs and tragedies of war with a crystallized understanding of what it takes to succeed in the most challenging environments that combat presents. Among this new generation of combat leaders, there are many war stories. After years of successful operations, including the heroic raid that killed Osama bin Laden, U.S. Navy SEALs have piqued the public's interest and received more attention than most of us ever wanted. This spotlight has shed light on aspects of our organization that should remain secret. In this book, we are careful not to remove that shroud any further. We do not discuss classified programs or violate non-disclosure agreements surrounding our operational experiences. Many SEAL memoirs have been written, some by experienced and well-respected operators who wanted to pass on the heroic deeds and accomplishments of our tribe. A few, unfortunately, by SEALs who hadn't contributed much to the community. Like so many of our SEAL teammates, we had a negative view when SEAL books were published. Why, then, would we choose to write a book? As battlefield leaders, we learned extremely valuable lessons through success and failure. We made mistakes and learned from them, discovering what works and what doesn't. We trained SEAL leaders and watched them implement the principles we ourselves had learned with the same success on difficult battlefields. Then, as we worked with businesses in the civilian sector, we again saw the leadership principles we followed in combat lead to victory for the companies and executives we trained. Many people, both in the SEAL teams and in the businesses we worked with, asked us to document our lessons learned in a concrete way that leaders could reference. We wrote this book to capture those leadership principles for future generations, so that they may not be forgotten, so that, as new wars begin and end, such crucial lessons will not have to be relearned, rewritten in more blood. We wrote this so that leadership lessons can continue to impact teams beyond the battlefield in all leadership situations, any company, team, or organization in which a group of people strives to achieve a goal and accomplish a mission. We wrote this book for leaders everywhere to utilize the principles we learned to lead and win. Who are we to write such a book? It may seem that anyone who believes they can write a book on leadership must think themselves the epitome of what every leader should aspire to be. But we are far from perfect. We continue to learn and grow as leaders every day, just as any leaders who are truly honest with themselves must. We were simply fortunate enough to experience an array of leadership challenges that taught us valuable lessons. This book is our best effort to pass those lessons on, not from a pedestal or a position of superiority, but from a humble place, where the scars of our failings still show. We are Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, SEAL officers who served together in our Ramadi, Iraq, during Operation Iraqi Freedom. There, we became intimately familiar with the humbling trials of war. We were lucky enough to build, train, and lead high-performance winning teams that proved exceptionally effective. We saw firsthand the perils of complacency, having served on a battlefield where at any time the possibility of our position being overrun by a large force of well-armed enemy fighters was quite real. We know what it means to fail, to lose, to be surprised, outmaneuvered, or simply beaten. Those lessons were the hardest, but perhaps the most important. We learned that leadership requires belief in the mission and an unyielding perseverance to achieve victory, particularly when doubters question whether victory is even possible. As SEAL leaders, we developed, tested, confirmed, and captured an array of leadership lessons, as well as management and organizational best practices. We then built and ran SEAL leadership training and helped write the doctrine for the next generation of SEAL leaders. Our task unit served through the bulk of what has become known as the Battle of Ramadi. But this book is not intended as a historical account of those combat operations. In a concise volume such as this, we cannot possibly tell the stories of service and sacrifice by the U.S. military men and women who served, fought, bled, and died there. We, the authors, and the SEALs we served with in Ramadi, were tremendously humbled by the courage, dedication, professionalism, selflessness, and sacrifice displayed by the units we served with, under both the U.S. Army 2nd Brigade, 28th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, and the U.S. Army 1st Brigade, 1st Armored Division, the Ready 1st Brigade Combat Team. These included a distinguished list of courageous and storied units, both U.S. Army and Marine Corps. It would require an entire book or series of books to detail their heroism and unfaltering dedication to the mission and our country. God bless them all.
Inside that band of brothers, carrying on the broader fight for Ramadi, was our SEAL Task Unit, Naval Special Warfare Task Unit Bruiser, Again, the combat experiences relayed in the following chapters are not meant for historic reference. Although we have used quotes to impart the message of conversations we had, they are certainly not perfect and are subject to the passage of time, the constraints of this format, and the shortfalls of memory. Our SEAL combat experiences depicted in this book have been carefully edited or altered to conceal specific tactics, techniques, and procedures, and to guard classified information about when and where specific operations took place and who participated in them. The manuscript was submitted and approved through the Pentagon's security review process in accordance with U.S. Department of Defense requirements. We have done our utmost to protect the identities of our brothers in the SEAL teams with whom we served and for those still serving in harm's way. They are silent professionals and seek no recognition. We take this solemn responsibility to protect them with the utmost seriousness. We took the same precaution with the rest of the warriors in the Ready 1st Brigade combat team. We have used almost entirely rank alone to identify these brave soldiers and Marines. This is by no means meant to detract from their service, but only to ensure their privacy and security. Likewise, we have done our utmost to protect the clients of our leadership and management consulting company, Echelon Front, LLC. We have refrained from using company names, changed the names of individuals, masked industry-specific information, and in some cases, altered the positions of executives and industries to protect the identities of people and companies. Their confidentiality is sacrosanct. While the stories of our lessons learned in the business world are based directly on our real experiences, in some cases, we combined situations, condensed timelines, and modified storylines to more clearly emphasize the principles we are trying to illustrate. The idea for this book was born from the realization that the principles critical to SEAL success on the battlefield, how SEALs train and prepare their leaders, how they mold and develop high-performance teams, and how they lead in combat, are directly applicable to success in any group, organization, corporation, business, and, to a broader degree, life. This book provides the reader with our formula for success, the mindset and guiding principles that enable SEAL leaders and combat units to achieve extraordinary results. It demonstrates how to apply these directly in business and life to likewise achieve victory. Introduction. Ramadi, Iraq, The Combat Leader's Dilemma. Leif Babin. Only the low rumble of diesel engines could be heard as a convoy of Humvees eased to a stop along the canal road. Iraqi farm fields and groves of date palm spread for some distance into the darkness in all directions. The night was quiet. Only the occasional barking of a distant dog and a lonely, flickering light gave any indication of the Iraqi village beyond. If intelligence reports were accurate, that village harbored a high-level terrorist leader and perhaps his entourage of well-armed enemy fighters. No lights were visible from the convoy, and darkness blanketed the road, blacking out most of the surroundings to the naked eye. But through the green glow of our night vision goggles, a flurry of activity could be seen. A platoon of Navy SEALs kitted up with helmets, body armor, weapons, and gear, along with an element of Iraqi soldiers, dismounted from the vehicles and quickly aligned in patrol formation. An explosive ordnance disposal, or EOD bomb technician, pushed forward and checked out a dirt bridge that crossed the canal ahead. Insurgents often planted deadly explosives at such choke points. Some were powerful enough to wipe out an entire vehicle and all its occupants in a sudden inferno of flying jagged metal and searing heat. For now, the way ahead appeared clear, and the assault force of SEALs and Iraqi soldiers stealthily pushed across the bridge on foot toward a group of buildings where the terrorists reportedly took refuge. A particularly evil insurgent responsible for the deaths of American soldiers, Iraqi security forces, and innocent civilians, this notorious al-Qaeda in Iraq emir has successfully evaded capture for months. Now was a critical opportunity to capture or kill him before his next attack. The SEAL assault force patrolled up a narrow street between the high walls of residential compounds and moved to the door of the target building. The deep concussion from the explosive breaching charge shattered the quiet night. It was a hell of a wake-up call for the occupants inside the house as a door blew in and aggressive, well-armed men with weapons ready for a fight entered the house. The Humvees pushed forward across the bridge, down the narrow street wide enough only for a single vehicle, and came to a stop in security positions around the target building. Each vehicle's turret contained a SEAL manning a heavy machine gun, ready to provide fire support if things went sideways. I was the ground force commander, the senior SEAL in charge of this operation. I had just stepped out of the command vehicle and onto the street near the target building when suddenly someone yelled, "We've got a squirter!" It was our EOD operator nearby who had seen the squirter, meaning someone fleeing the target building. Perhaps it was the terrorist himself or someone with information on his whereabouts. We couldn't allow him to escape. The EOD operator and I were the only ones in position to pursue him, so we sprinted after the man. We chased him down a narrow alleyway, around a group of buildings, and down a dark alleyway that paralleled the street where our Humvees were parked. Finally, we caught up to him, a middle-aged Iraqi man in a traditional Arabic robe, or dishdasha. As we were trained, he was quickly forced to the ground and his hands controlled. Those hands didn't possess a weapon, but he might have a grenade in his pocket or worse, be wearing an explosive suicide belt under his clothing. Anyone associated with such a high-level terrorist might have such deadly devices, and we couldn't assume otherwise. Just to be sure, he had to be searched quickly. In that instant, I became keenly aware that we were all alone in the world, totally separated from our unit. The rest of our SEAL assault force didn't know where we were. There hadn't been time to notify them. I wasn't even sure exactly where we were located relevant to their position. All around us were darkened windows and rooftops of unclear buildings where enemy fighters might be lurking, preparing to attack and unleash hell on us at any second. We had to get back and link up with our troops ASAP. But even before we could cuff the man's hands and begin a pat-down search for weapons, I heard movement. As I looked down the alleyway through my night vision goggles, suddenly 7 or 8 men rounded the corner not 40 yards from us. They were heavily armed and rapidly moving toward us. For a split second, my mind questioned what my eyes were seeing, but there it was. The unmistakable outlines of AK-47 rifles, an RPG-7 shoulder-fired rocket, and at least one belt-fed machine gun. They weren't there to shake our hands. These were armed enemy fighters maneuvering to attack. Now the two of us, the EOD operator and I, were in a hell of a tight spot. The subdued Iraqi man and possible terrorists we were holding had not yet been searched, a situation that carried huge risks. We needed to fall back and link up with the rest of our force. Now, with a larger enemy force maneuvering on us with heavier firepower, the two of us were outnumbered and outgunned. Finally, I desperately needed to resume my role as ground force commander, dispense with handling prisoners, and get back to my job of command and control for the assault force, our vehicles, and coordination with our distant supporting assets. All this had to be accomplished immediately. I had deployed to Iraq before, but never had I been in a situation like this. Though combat is often depicted in movies and video games, this was not a movie and it certainly was no game. These were heavily armed and dangerous men determined to kill American and Iraqi troops. Were any of us to fall into their hands, we could expect to be tortured in unspeakable ways and then decapitated on video for all the world to see. They wanted nothing more than to kill us and were willing to die by the dozen to do so. Blood pumping, adrenaline surging, I knew every nanosecond counted. This situation could overwhelm the most competent leader and seasoned combat veteran. But the words of my immediate boss, our task unit commander, Lieutenant Commander Jocko Willink, echoed in my head. Words I'd regularly heard during a full year of intensive training and preparation. Relax. Look around. Make a call. Our SEAL platoon and task unit had trained extensively through dozens of desperate, chaotic, and overwhelming situations to prepare for just such a moment as this. I understood how to implement the laws of combat that Jocko had taught us. Cover and move. Simple. Prioritize and execute. And decentralize command. The laws of combat were the key to not just surviving a dire situation such as this, but actually thriving, enabling us to totally dominate the enemy and win. They guided my next move. Prioritize. Of all the pressing tasks at hand, if I didn't first handle the armed enemy fighters bearing down on us, within the next few seconds, nothing else would matter. We would be dead. Worse, the enemy fighters would continue their attack and might kill more of our SEAL assault force. This was my highest priority. Execute. Without hesitation, I engaged the enemy fighters moving toward us with my Colt M4 rifle, hammering the first insurgent in line carrying the RPG with 3 to 4 rounds to the chest, dead center. As he dropped, I rapidly shifted fire to the next bad guy, then the next. The muzzle flashes and report of the rifle announced to all within earshot that a firefight was on. The group of enemy fighters hadn't bargained for this. They panicked, and those who could still run beat a hasty retreat back the way they had come. Some crawled and others dragged the wounded and dying around the street corner and out of sight as I continued to engage them. I knew I had hit at least 3 or 4 of them. Though the rounds had been accurate and impacted the enemy fighters' centers of mass, the 5.56mm round was just too small to have much knockdown power. Now the bad guys were around the corner, some no doubt dead or gravely wounded, and soon to be. But surely those who were unscathed would regroup and attack again, likely rounding up even more fighters to join their efforts. We needed to move. There was no time for a complex plan, nor did I have the luxury of providing specific direction to my shooting buddy, the EOD operator next to me. But we had to execute immediately. Having dealt with the highest priority task, armed enemy fighters maneuvering to attack, and with that threat at least temporarily checked, our next priority was to fall back and link up with our SEAL assault force. To do this, the EOD operator and I utilized cover and move, teamwork. I provided cover fire while he bounded back to a position where he could cover me. Then I moved to a new position to cover for him. Thus, we leapfrogged our way back toward the rest of our team with the prisoner in tow. As soon as we reached the cover of a concrete wall in a perpendicular alleyway, I kept my weapon at the ready to cover while the EOD operator conducted a quick search of the prisoner. Finding no weapons, we then continued back and linked up with our team and, once there, handed off the prisoner to the designated prisoner handling team with the assault force. Then I resumed my role as ground force commander, directing my mobility commander in charge of the vehicles to move a Humvee with its 50 caliber machine gun to a position where we could repel any further attacks from the direction the enemy fighters had come. Next, I had our SEAL radioman communicate with our Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, located miles away to keep them informed and get the TOC spinning to coordinate air support to assist us. For the next half hour, the insurgent fighters attempted to maneuver on us and dumped hundreds of rounds in our direction, but we remained one step ahead of them and repeatedly beat back their attacks. The man we had chased down turned out not to be our target. He was briefly detained for questioning, turned over to a detention facility, but then released. We didn't find our target that night. The Al-Qaeda in Iraq Amir had apparently departed sometime prior to our arrival. But we killed at least a handful of his fighters, and we collected valuable intelligence on his operations and organization. Though the operation failed to achieve its primary objective, we did demonstrate to the terrorist and his cronies that there were no areas where they could safely hide. This likely forced him, in the short term at least, to focus efforts on his own preservation rather than plotting his next attack. In that, we had helped protect American lives, in addition to Iraqi security forces and innocent civilians, which was at least a consolation prize. For me, the biggest gain was in leadership lessons learned. Some were simple, as in the acknowledgement that before any combat operation, I needed to do a much more careful map study to memorize the basic layout and the area around the target for those times when I couldn't immediately access my map. Some lessons were procedural, like establishing clear guidance for all our operators about just how far we should chase squirters without first coordinating with the rest of the team. Other lessons were strategic. With proper understanding and application of the laws of combat, we had not only survived a difficult and dangerous situation, but dominated. As an entire generation of SEAL combat leaders and I would learn, these laws of combat could be applied with equal effectiveness in an intense firefight or in less dynamic or high-pressure situations. They guided me through months of sustained urban combat in Ramadi, throughout my career as a SEAL officer, and beyond. Those same principles are the key to any team success on the battlefield or in the business world. Any situation where a group of people must work together to execute a task and accomplish a mission. When applied to any team, group, or organization, the proper understanding and execution of these laws of combat would mean one thing: victory.
Leadership, the single most important factor. Leif Babin and Jocko Willink. This book is about leadership. It was written for leaders of teams large and small, for men and women, for any person who aspires to better themselves. Though it contains exciting accounts of SEAL combat operations, this book is not a war memoir. It is instead a collection of lessons learned from our experiences, to help other leaders achieve victory. If it serves as a useful guide to leaders who aspire to build, train, and lead high-performance winning teams, then it has accomplished its purpose. Among the legions of leadership books in publication, we found most focus on individual practices and personal character traits. We also observed that many corporate leadership training programs and management consulting firms do the same. But without a team, a group of individuals working to accomplish a mission, there can be no leadership. The only meaningful measure for a leader is whether the team succeeds or fails. For all the definitions, descriptions, and characterizations of leaders, there are only two that matter: effective and ineffective. Effective leaders lead successful teams that accomplish their mission and win. Ineffective leaders do not. The principles and concepts described in this book, when properly understood and implemented, enable any leader to become effective and dominate his or her battlefield. Every leader and every team at some point or time will fail and must confront that failure. That, too, is a big part of this book. We are by no means infallible leaders. No one is, no matter how experienced. Nor do we have all the answers. No leader does. We've made huge mistakes. Often our mistakes provided the greatest lessons, humbled us, and enabled us to grow and become better. For leaders, the humility to admit and own mistakes and develop a plan to overcome them is essential to success. The best leaders are not driven by ego or personal agendas. They are simply focused on the mission and how best to accomplish it. As leaders, we have experienced both triumph and tragedy. The bulk of our combat experiences and the stories told in this book come from what will always be the highlight of our military careers: SEAL Team 3, Task Unit Bruiser, and our historic combat deployment to Ramadi, Iraq in 2006, through what became known as the Battle of Ramadi. I led Bruiser as Task Unit Commander. Leif and his SEALs of Charlie Platoon, including lead sniper and point man Chris Kyle, the American sniper, and their brothers in Delta Platoon, fought in what remains some of the heaviest, sustained urban combat operations in the history of the SEAL teams. Bruiser SEALs played an integral role in the U.S. Army 1st Armored Division Ready 1st Brigade's seize, clear, hold, and build strategy that systematically liberated the war-torn, insurgent-held city of Ramadi and radically lowered the level of violence. These operations established security in the most dangerous and volatile area in Iraq at the time and set the conditions for the Anbar Awakening, a movement that eventually turned the tide for the United States in Iraq. In the spring of 2006, when Task Unit Bruiser first arrived in Ramadi, the war-torn capital city of Al-Anbar province was the deadly epicenter of the Iraqi insurgency. Ramadi, a city of 400,000, was a total war zone, marred by rubble pile buildings and bomb craters, the scars of continuous violence. At that time, U.S. forces controlled only about 1/3 of the city. A brutal insurgency of well-armed and determined enemy fighters controlled the rest. Every day, brave U.S. soldiers and Marines were bloodied. The Camp Ramadi Medical Facility saw a near constant flow of severely wounded or dead. Valiant U.S. military surgical teams desperately fought to save lives. A U.S. intelligence report leaked to the press grimly labeled Ramadi and Anbar province all but lost. Virtually no one thought it possible that U.S. forces could turn the situation around there and win. Through the summer and fall of 2006, I orchestrated Task Unit Bruiser's contribution to the Ready 1st Brigade's efforts as our SEAL platoons fought side by side with U.S. Army soldiers and Marines to clear out enemy-held areas of the city. Leif led Charlie Platoon SEALs in scores of violent gun battles and highly effective sniper overwatch missions. Delta Platoon fought countless fierce battles as well. Together, Task Unit Bruiser SEALs, snipers, riflemen, and machine gunners killed hundreds of enemy fighters and disrupted enemy attacks on U.S. soldiers, Marines, and Iraqi security forces. Bruiser SEALs frequently spearheaded the Ready First operations as the first U.S. troops on the ground in the most dangerous enemy-held neighborhoods. We secured buildings, took the high ground, and then provided cover as soldiers and Marines moved into contested areas, and Army combat engineers furiously worked to build and fortify outposts in enemy territory. Bruiser SEALs and the Ready First soldiers and Marines built a bond that will forever be remembered by those who served there. Through much blood, sweat, and toil, the Ready First Combat Team and Task Unit Bruiser accomplished the mission. The violent insurgency was routed from the city. Tribal sheikhs in Ramadi joined with U.S. forces, and the Anbar Awakening was born. Ultimately, in the months following TU Bruiser's departure, Ramadi was stabilized, and the level of violence plummeted to levels previously unimaginable. Tragically, Task Unit Bruiser paid a tremendous cost for the success of these operations. 8 SEALs were wounded, and 3 of the best SEAL warriors imaginable gave their lives. Mark Lee and Mike Mansour were killed in action. Ryan Jobe was blinded by an enemy sniper's bullet and later died while in the hospital recovering from surgery to repair his combat wounds. These losses were devastating to us, and yet they were only 3 of the nearly 100 U.S. troops killed in action that were part of the Ready First Brigade combat team. Each one a tragic, immeasurable loss. Despite the doubters and naysayers, Ramadi was won. The city stabilized, and the populace secured. By early 2007, enemy attacks plunged from an average of 30 to 50 each day throughout much of 2006 to an average of 1 per week, then 1 per month. Ramadi remained a model of stability and one of the safest areas of Iraq, outside the historically stable Kurdish-controlled north for years afterwards. These operations were victorious, but also extremely humbling. The takeaways, both good and bad, vast. The Battle of Ramadi provided a litany of lessons learned, which we were able to capture and pass on. The greatest of these was the recognition that leadership is the most important factor on the battlefield, the single greatest reason behind the success of any team. By leadership, we do not mean just the senior commanders at the top, but the crucial leaders at every level of the team. The senior enlisted leaders, the fire team leaders in charge of 4 people, the squad leaders in charge of 8, and the junior petty officers that stepped up, took charge, and led. They each played an integral role in the success of our team. We were fortunate for the opportunity to lead such an amazing group of SEALs who triumphed in that difficult fight. Upon returning home from combat, we stepped into critical roles as leadership instructors. For many years, Navy SEAL leadership training consisted almost entirely of OJT, on-the-job training, and mentoring. How a junior leader was brought up depended entirely on the strength, experience, and patient guidance of a mentor. Some mentors were exceptional, others lacking. While mentorship from the right leaders is critical, this method left some substantial gaps in leadership knowledge and understanding. We helped to change that and developed leadership training curriculum to build a strong foundation for all SEAL leaders. As the officer in charge of all training for the West Coast SEAL teams, I directed some of the most realistic and challenging combat training in the world. I placed new emphasis on training leaders in critical decision-making and effective communication in high-pressure situations to better prepare them for combat. Leif ran the SEAL Junior Officer Training Course, the basic leadership training program for every officer who graduated from the SEAL training pipeline. There, he reshaped and enhanced training to more effectively establish the critical leadership foundations necessary for new SEAL officers to succeed in combat. In these roles, we helped guide a new generation of SEAL leaders who continued to perform with unparalleled success on the battlefield, validating the leadership principles we taught them. Some may wonder how Navy SEAL combat leadership principles translate outside the military realm to leading any team in any capacity. But combat is reflective of life, only amplified and intensified. Decisions have immediate consequences, and everything, absolutely everything, is at stake. The right decision, even when all seems lost, can snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. The wrong decision, even when a victorious outcome seems all but certain, can result in deadly, catastrophic failure. In that regard, a combat leader can acquire a lifetime of leadership lessons learned in only a few deployments. We hope to dispel the myth that military leadership is easy because subordinates robotically and blindly follow orders. On the contrary, U.S. military personnel are smart, creative, free-thinking individuals, human beings. They must literally risk life and limb to accomplish the mission. For this reason, they must believe in the cause for which they are fighting. They must believe in the plan they are asked to execute. And most important, they must believe in and trust the leader they are asked to follow. This is especially true in the SEAL teams, where innovation and input from everyone, including the most junior personnel, are encouraged. Combat leadership requires getting a diverse team of people in various groups to execute highly complex missions in order to achieve strategic goals, something that directly correlates with any company or organization. The same principles that make SEAL combat leaders and SEAL units so effective on the battlefield can be applied to the business world with the same success. Since leaving the SEAL teams, we have worked with companies across a wide array of industries, from the financial, energy, technology, and construction sectors to the insurance, auto, retail, manufacturing, pharmaceutical, and service sectors. Having trained and worked with a large number of leaders and company leadership teams, we have witnessed the extraordinary impact in increased efficiency, productivity, and profitability that results when these principles are properly understood and implemented. The leadership and teamwork concepts contained in this book are not abstract theories, but practical and applicable. We encourage leaders to do the things they know they probably should be doing, but aren't. By not doing those things, they are failing as leaders and failing their teams. While rooted in common sense and based on the reality of practical experience, these principles require skill to implement. Such concepts are simple, but not easy, and they apply to virtually any situation, to any group, team, organization, or individual seeking to improve performance, capability, efficiency, and teamwork. They are sometimes counterintuitive and require focused effort and training to implement in practice. But this book provides the necessary guidance so that anyone can apply the principles and, with dedication and discipline over time, master them and become effective leaders.
Organization and structure. The lessons we learned as SEAL leaders through our combined years of experience are numerous. For this book, we have focused our efforts on the most critical aspects, the fundamental building blocks of leadership. The book derives its title from the underlying principle, the mindset that provides the foundation for all the rest, extreme ownership. Leaders must own everything in their world. There is no one else to blame. This book is organized into 3 parts. Part 1, Winning the War Within. Part 2, The Laws of Combat. And Part 3, Sustaining Victory. Winning the War Within develops the fundamental building blocks and mindset necessary to lead and win. The Laws of Combat covers the 4 critical concepts described earlier that enable a team to perform at the highest level and dominate. Finally, Sustaining Victory discusses the more nuanced and difficult balance that leaders must navigate in order to maintain the edge and keep the team perpetually operating at the highest level. Each chapter focuses on a different leadership concept, each unique, though closely related and often mutually supporting. Within each chapter, there are 3 subsections. The first identifies a leadership lesson learned through our U.S. Navy SEAL combat or training experience. The second subsection explains that leadership principle. The third demonstrates the principle's application to the business world based on our work with a multitude of companies in a broad range of industries. We believe in these leadership concepts because we have seen them work time and again, both in combat and in business. Their proper application and understanding ensure effective leaders and high-performing teams that produce extraordinary results. These principles empower those teams to dominate their battlefields by enabling leaders to fulfill their purpose, lead and win.
Part 1. Winning the War Within. Chapter 1. Extreme Ownership. Jocko Willink. The Malab District, Ramadi, Iraq. Fog of war. The early morning light was dimmed by a literal fog of war that filled the air. Soot from tires the insurgents had set alight in the streets, clouds of dust kicked up from the roads by U.S. tanks and Humvees, and powdered concrete from the walls of buildings pulverized by machine gun fire. As our armored Humvee rounded the corner and headed down the street toward the gunfire, I saw a U.S. M1A2 Abrams tank in the middle of the road up ahead. Its turret rotated with the huge main gun trained on a building at almost point-blank range. Through the particle-filled air, I could see a smoky red mist, clearly from a red smoke grenade used by American forces in the area as a general signal for help. My mind was racing. This was our first major operation in Ramadi, and it was total chaos. Beyond the literal fog of war impeding our vision, the figurative fog of war, often attributed to Prussian military strategist Karl von Clausewitz, had descended upon us, and it was thick with confusion, inaccurate information, broken communications, and mayhem. For this operation, we had 4 separate elements of SEALs in various sectors of this violent, war-torn city. 2 SEAL sniper teams with U.S. Army Scout snipers and a contingent of Iraqi soldiers, and another element of SEALs embedded with Iraqi soldiers and their U.S. Army combat advisors assigned to clear an entire sector, building by building. Finally, my SEAL senior enlisted advisor, a non-commissioned officer, and I rode along with one of the Army company commanders. In total, about 300 U.S. and Iraqi troops, friendly forces, were operating in this dangerous and hotly contested neighborhood of eastern Ramadi known as the Malab District. The entire place was crawling with Muj, as American forces called them. The enemy insurgent fighters called themselves Mujahideen, Arabic for those engaged in jihad, which we had shortened for expediency. They subscribed to a ruthless militant version of Islam, and they were cunning, barbaric, and lethal. For years, the Malab had remained firmly in their hands. Now, U.S. forces aimed to change that. The operation had kicked off before sunrise, and with the sun now creeping up over the horizon, everyone was shooting. The myriad radio networks, or nets, used by U.S. ground and air units exploded with chatter and incoming reports. Details of U.S. and Iraqi troops wounded or killed came in from different sectors. Following them were reports of enemy fighters killed. U.S. elements tried to decipher what was happening with other U.S. and Iraqi units in adjacent sectors. U.S. Marine Corps Anglico, Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company teams coordinated with American attack aircraft overhead in an effort to drop bombs on enemy positions. Only a few hours into the operation, both of my SEAL sniper elements had been attacked and were now embroiled in serious gunfights. As the element of Iraqi soldiers, U.S. Army soldiers, and our SEALs cleared buildings across the sector, they met heavy resistance. Dozens of insurgent fighters mounted blistering attacks with PKC Russian belt-fed machine guns, deadly RPG-7 shoulder-fired rockets, and AK-47 automatic rifle fire. As we monitored the radio, we heard the U.S. advisors with one of the Iraqi elements in advance of the rest report that they were engaged in a fierce firefight and requested the QRF, or Quick Reaction Force, for help. This particular QRF consisted of 4 U.S. Army armored Humvees, each mounted with a .50 caliber machine gun, and a dozen or so U.S. soldiers that could dismount and render assistance. Minutes later, over the radio net, one of my SEAL sniper teams called for the heavy QRF, a section, meaning 2, of U.S. M1A2 Abrams main battle tanks that could bring the thunder with their 120mm main guns and machine guns. That meant my SEALs were in a world of hurt and in need of serious help. I asked the U.S. Army company commander we were with to follow the tanks in, and he complied. Our Humvee rolled to a stop just behind one of the Abrams tanks, its huge main gun pointed directly at a building and ready to engage. Pushing open the heavy armored door of my vehicle, I stepped out onto the street. I had a gut feeling that something was wrong. Running over to a Marine Anglico gunnery sergeant, I asked him, "What's going on?" "Hot damn," he shouted with excitement. "There's some mooj in that building right there putting up a serious fight." He pointed to a building across the street, his weapon trained in that direction. It was clear he thought these mooj were hardcore. They killed one of our Iraqi soldiers when we entered the building, and wounded a few more. We've been hammering them, and I'm working to get some bombs dropped on them now. He was in the midst of coordinating an airstrike with U.S. aircraft overhead to wipe out the enemy fighters holed up inside the building. I looked around. The building he pointed to was riddled with bullet holes. The QRF Humvees had put over 150 rounds from a .50 caliber heavy machine gun into it, and many more smaller caliber rounds from their rifles and light machine guns. Now, the Abrams tank had its huge main gun trained on the building, preparing to reduce it to rubble and kill everyone inside. And if that still didn't do the job, bombs from the sky would be next. But something didn't add up. We were extremely close to where one of our SEAL sniper teams was supposed to be. That sniper team had abandoned the location they had originally planned to use, and were in the process of relocating to a new building when all the shooting started. In the mayhem, they hadn't reported their exact location, but I knew it would be close to the point where I was standing, close to the building the Marine gunny had just pointed to. What really didn't add up was that these Iraqi soldiers and their U.S. advisors shouldn't have arrived here for another couple of hours. No other friendly forces were after it entered this sector until we had properly deconflicted, determined the exact position of our SEAL sniper team, and passed that information to the other friendly units in the operation. But for some reason, there were dozens of Iraqi troops and their U.S. Army and Marine combat advisors in the area. It made no sense to me. "Hold what you got, Gunny. I'm going to check it out," I said, motioning toward the building on which he had been working to coordinate the airstrike. He looked at me as if I were completely crazy. His Marines and a full platoon of Iraqi soldiers had been engaged in a vicious firefight with the enemy fighters inside that house and couldn't dislodge them. Whoever they were, they had put up one hell of a fight. In the gunny's mind, for us to even approach that place was pretty much suicidal. I nodded at my senior enlisted SEAL, who nodded back, and we moved across the street towards the enemy-infested house. Like most of the houses in Iraq, there was an 8-foot concrete wall around it. We approached the door to the compound, which was slightly open. With my M4 rifle at the ready, I kicked the door the rest of the way open, only to find I was staring at one of my SEAL platoon chiefs. He stared back at me in wide-eyed surprise. "What happened?" I asked him. "Some mooj entered the compound. We shot one of them and they attacked, hardcore. They brought it." I remembered what the gunny had just told me. One of their Iraqi soldiers had been shot when he entered the compound. At that moment, it all became clear. In the chaos and confusion, somehow a rogue element of Iraqi soldiers had strayed outside the boundaries to which they had been confined and attempted to enter the building occupied by our SEAL sniper team. In the early morning darkness, our SEAL sniper element had seen the silhouette of a man armed with an AK-47 creep into their compound. While there were not supposed to be any friendlies in the vicinity, there were many enemy fighters known to be in the area. With that in mind, our SEALs had engaged the man with the AK-47, thinking they were under attack. Then all hell broke loose. When gunfire erupted from the house, the Iraqi soldiers outside the compound returned fire and pulled back behind the cover of the concrete walls across the street and in the surrounding buildings. They called in reinforcements, and U.S. Marines and Army troops responded with a vicious barrage of gunfire into the house they assumed was occupied by enemy fighters. Meanwhile, inside the house, our SEALs were pinned down and unable to clearly identify that it was friendly shooting at them. All they could do was return fire as best they could and keep up the fight to prevent being overrun by what they thought were enemy fighters. The U.S. Marine Anglico team had come very close to directing airstrikes on the house the SEALs were holed up in. When the .50 caliber machine gun opened up on their position, our SEAL sniper element inside the building, thinking they were under heavy enemy attack, called in the heavy QRF Abrams tanks for support. That's when I had arrived on the scene. Inside the compound, the SEAL chief stared back at me, somewhat confused. He no doubt wondered how I had just walked through the hellacious enemy attack to reach his building. It was a blue on blue, I said to him. Blue on blue, friendly fire, fratricide, the worst thing that could happen. To be killed or wounded by the enemy in battle was bad enough. But to be accidentally killed or wounded by friendly fire because someone had screwed up was the most horrible fate. It was also a reality. I had heard the story of X-Ray Platoon from SEAL Team 1 in Vietnam. The squad split up on a night patrol in the jungle, lost their bearings, and when they bumped into each other again in the darkness, they mistook each other for the enemy and opened up with gunfire. A ferocious firefight ensued, leaving one of their own dead and several wounded. That was the last X-Ray Platoon in the SEAL teams. Henceforth, the name was banished. It was a curse and a lesson. Friendly fire was completely unacceptable in the SEAL teams, and now it had just happened to us, to my SEAL task unit. What? The SEAL chief asked me with utter disbelief. It was a blue on blue, I said again, calmly and as a matter of fact. There was no time to debate or discuss. There were real bad guys out here. And even as we spoke, sporadic gunfire could be heard all around as other elements engaged insurgents in the vicinity. Now what do you got? I asked, needing to know his status and that of his men. One SEAL fragged in the face, not too bad, but everyone is rattled. Let's get him out of here, replied the chief. An armored personnel carrier, or APC, had arrived with a heavy QRF and was sitting out front. There's an APC out front. Get your boys loaded up, I told him. Roger, said the chief. The SEAL chief, one of the best tactical leaders I'd ever known, quickly got the rest of his SEALs and other troopers down to the front door. They looked more rattled than any human beings I'd ever seen. Having been on the receiving end of devastating 50 caliber machine gun rounds punching through the walls around them, they had stared death in the face and did not think they would survive. But they quickly got it together, boarded the APC, and left for the nearby U.S. forward operating base, except the SEAL chief. Tough as nails and ready for more, he stayed with me, unfazed by what had happened and ready for whatever came next. I made my way back over to the Marine Anglico gunny. The building is clear, I told him. Roger that, he replied, looking surprised as he quickly reported it on the radio. Where's the captain? I asked, wanting to find the U.S. Army company commander. Upstairs, here, he replied, motioning toward the building we were in front of. I walked upstairs and found the company commander hunkered down on the roof of a building. Everyone okay? He asked. It was a blue on blue, I replied bluntly. What? He asked, stunned. It was a blue on blue, I repeated. One Iraqi soldier, KIA. A few more wounded. One of my guys wounded, fragged in the face. Everyone else is okay, by a miracle. Roger, he replied, stunned and disappointed at what had transpired. No doubt, as an outstanding leader himself, he felt somewhat responsible. But having operated in this chaotic, urban battlefield for months alongside Iraqi soldiers, he knew how easily such a thing could happen. But we still had work to do and had to drive on. The operation continued. We conducted 2 more back-to-back missions, cleared a large portion of the Moab district, and killed dozens of insurgents. The rest of the mission was a success. But that didn't matter. I felt sick. One of my men was wounded. An Iraqi soldier was dead and others were wounded. We did it to ourselves, and it happened under my command. When we completed the last mission of the day, I went to the Battalion Tactical Operations Center, where I had my field computer set up to receive emails from higher headquarters. I dreaded opening and answering the inevitable email inquiries about what had transpired. I wished I had died out on the battlefield. I felt that I deserved it. My email inbox was full. Word had rapidly spread that we had a blue on blue. I opened an email from my commanding officer, or CO, that went straight to the point. It read, "Shut down. Conduct no more operations. Investigating officer, command master chief, and I are en route." In typical fashion for a Navy mishap, the CO had appointed an investigating officer to determine the facts of what happened and who was responsible. Another email from one of my old bosses stationed in another city in Iraq, but privy to what was happening in Ramadi, read simply, "Heard you had a blue on blue. What the hell?" All the good things I had done and the solid reputation I had worked hard to establish in my SEAL career were now meaningless. Despite the many successful combat operations I had led, I was now the commander of a unit that had committed the SEAL mortal sin. A day passed as I waited for the arrival of the investigating officer, our CO, and Command Master Chief, the senior enlisted SEAL at the command. In the meantime, they directed me to prepare a brief detailing what had happened. I knew what this meant. They were looking for someone to blame, and most likely, someone to relieve. The military euphemism for someone to fire. Frustrated, angry, and disappointed that this had happened, I began gathering information. As we debriefed, it was obvious there were some serious mistakes made by many individuals both during the planning phase and on the battlefield during execution. Plans were altered, but notifications weren't sent. The communication plan was ambiguous, and confusion about the specific timing of radio procedures contributed to critical failures. The Iraqi army had adjusted their plan, but had not told us. Timelines were pushed without clarification. Locations of friendly forces had not been reported. The list went on and on. Within Task Unit Bruiser, my own SEAL troop, similar mistakes had been made. The specific location of the sniper team in question had not been passed on to other units. Positive identification of the assumed enemy combatant, who turned out to be an Iraqi soldier, had been insufficient. A thorough SITREP, or situation report, had not been passed to me after the initial engagement took place. The list of mistakes was substantial. As directed, I put together a brief, a Microsoft PowerPoint presentation with timelines and depictions of the movement of friendly units on a map of the area. Then I assembled a list of everything that everyone had done wrong. It was a thorough explanation of what had happened. It outlined the critical failures that had turned the mission into a nightmare and cost the life of one Iraqi soldier, wounded several more, and, but for a true miracle, could have cost several of our SEALs their lives. But something was missing. There was some problem, some piece that I hadn't identified, and it made me feel like the truth wasn't coming out. Who was to blame? I reviewed my brief again and again, trying to figure out the missing piece, the single point of failure that had led to the incident. But there were so many factors, and I couldn't figure it out. Finally, the CO, the CMC, and the investigating officer arrived at our base. They were going to drop their gear, grab some food at the chow hall, and then we would bring everyone together to debrief the event. I looked through my notes again, trying to place the blame. Then it hit me. Despite all the failures of individuals, units, and leaders, and despite the myriad of mistakes that had been made, there was only one person to blame for everything that had gone wrong on the operation. Me. I hadn't been with our sniper team when they engaged the Iraqi soldier. I hadn't been controlling the rogue element of Iraqis that entered the compound, but that didn't matter. As the SEAL Task Unit commander, the senior leader on the ground in charge of the mission, I was responsible for everything in Task Unit Bruiser. I had to take complete ownership of what went wrong. That is what a leader does, even if it means getting fired. If anyone was to be blamed and fired for what happened, let it be me. A few minutes later, I walked into the platoon space where everyone was gathered to debrief. The silence was deafening. The CO sat in the front row. The CMC stood ominously in the back. The SEAL that had been wounded, fragged in the face by a .50 caliber round, was there, his face bandaged up. I stood before the group. Whose fault was this? I asked the roomful of teammates. After a few moments of silence, the SEAL who had mistakenly engaged the Iraqi soldier spoke up. It was my fault. I should have positively identified my target. No, I responded. It wasn't your fault. Whose fault was it? I asked the group again. It was my fault, said the radio men from the sniper element. I should have passed our position sooner. Wrong, I responded. It wasn't your fault. Whose fault was it? I asked again. It was my fault, said another SEAL, who was a combat advisor with the Iraqi Army clearance team. I should have controlled the Iraqis and made sure they stayed in their sector. Negative, I said. You are not to blame. More of my SEALs were ready to explain what they had done wrong and how it had contributed to the failure. But I had heard enough. You know whose fault this is? You know who gets all the blame for this? The entire group sat there in silence, including the CO, the CMC, and investigating officer. No doubt they were wondering whom I would hold responsible. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "There's only one person to blame for this. Me. I am the commander. I am responsible for the entire operation. As the senior man, I am responsible for every action that takes place on the battlefield. There is no one to blame but me. And I will tell you this right now. I will make sure that nothing like this ever happens to us again." It was a heavy burden to bear, but it was absolutely true. I was the leader. I was in charge, and I was responsible. Thus, I had to take ownership of everything that went wrong. Despite the tremendous blow to my reputation and to my ego, it was the right thing to do. The only thing to do. I apologized to the wounded SEAL, explaining that it was my fault he was wounded, and that we were all lucky he wasn't dead. We then proceeded to go through the entire operation, piece by piece, identifying everything that happened and what we could do going forward to prevent it from happening again. Looking back, it is clear that, despite what happened, the full ownership I took of the situation actually increased the trust my commanding officer and Master Chief had in me. If I had tried to pass the blame onto others, I suspect I would have been fired, deservedly so. The SEALs in the troop, who did not expect me to take the blame, respected the fact that I had taken full responsibility for everything that had happened. They knew it was a dynamic situation caused by a multitude of factors, but I owned them all. The U.S. Army and U.S. Marine conventional commanders took the debrief points as lessons learned and moved on. Having fought in Ramadi for an extended period of time, they understood something we SEALs did not. Blue on blue was a risk that had to be mitigated as much as possible in an urban environment. But that risk could not be eliminated. This was urban combat, the most complex and difficult of all warfare, and it was simply impossible to conduct operations without some risk of blue on blue. But for SEALs accustomed to working in small groups against point targets, fratricide should never happen. A very senior and highly respected SEAL officer, who before joining the Navy had been a U.S. Marine Corps platoon commander in Vietnam at the historic Battle of Hue City, came to visit our task unit shortly after the incident. He told me that many of the Marine casualties in Hue were friendly fire, part of the brutal reality of urban combat. He understood what we had experienced, and just how easily it could happen. But, while a blue-on-blue incident in an environment like Ramadi might be likely, if not expected, we vowed to never let it happen again. We analyzed what had happened and implemented the lessons learned. We revised our standard operating procedures and planning methodology to better mitigate risk. As a result of this tragic incident, we undoubtedly saved lives going forward. While we were mistakenly engaged by friendly elements again many times during the rest of the deployment, we never let it escalate and were always able to regain control quickly. But the tactical avoidance of fratricide was only part of what I learned. When I returned home from deployment, I took over Training Detachment 1, which managed all training for West Coast SEAL platoons and task units in preparation for combat deployments. I set up scenarios where blue-on-blue shootings were almost guaranteed to happen. When they did, we, the training cadre, explained how to avoid them. But more important, the commanders in training could learn what I had learned about leadership. While some commanders took full responsibility for blue-on-blue, others blamed their subordinates for simulated fratricide incidents in training. These weaker commanders would get a solid explanation about the burden of command and the deep meaning of responsibility. The leader is truly and ultimately responsible for everything. That is extreme ownership, the fundamental core of what constitutes an effective leader in the SEAL teams or in any leadership endeavor. Principle. On any team, in any organization, all responsibility for success and failure rests with the leader. The leader must own everything in his or her world. There is no one else to blame. The leader must acknowledge mistakes and admit failures, take ownership of them, and develop a plan to win. The best leaders don't just take responsibility for their job. They take extreme ownership of everything that impacts their mission. This fundamental core concept enables SEAL leaders to lead high-performance teams in extraordinary circumstances and win. But extreme ownership isn't a principle whose application is limited to the battlefield. This concept is the number one characteristic of any high-performance winning team in any military unit, organization, sports team, or business team in any industry. When subordinates aren't doing what they should, leaders that exercise extreme ownership cannot blame the subordinates. They must first look in the mirror at themselves. The leader bears full responsibility for explaining the strategic mission, developing the tactics, and securing the training and resources to enable the team to properly and successfully execute. If an individual on the team is not performing at the level required for the team to succeed, the leader must train and mentor that underperformer. But if the underperformer continually fails to meet standards, then a leader who exercises extreme ownership must be loyal to the team and the mission above any individual. If underperformers cannot improve, the leader must make the tough call to terminate them and hire others who can get the job done. It is all on the leader. As individuals, we often attribute the success of others to luck or circumstances and make excuses for our own failures and the failures of our team. We blame our own poor performance on bad luck, circumstances beyond our control, or poorly performing subordinates. Anyone but ourselves. Total responsibility for failure is a difficult thing to accept, and taking ownership when things go wrong requires extraordinary humility and courage. But doing just that is an absolute necessity to learning, growing as a leader, and improving a team's performance. Extreme ownership requires leaders to look at an organization's problems through the objective lens of reality, without emotional attachments to agendas or plans. It mandates that a leader set ego aside, accept responsibility for failures, attack weaknesses, and consistently work to build a better and more effective team. Such a leader, however, does not take credit for his or her team's successes, but bestows that honor upon his subordinate leaders and team members. When a leader sets such an example and expects this from junior leaders within the team, the mindset develops into the team's culture at every level. With extreme ownership, junior leaders take charge of their smaller teams and their piece of the mission. Efficiency and effectiveness increase exponentially, and a high-performance winning team is the result. Application to business. The vice president's plan looked good on paper. The board of directors had approved the plan the previous year and thought it would decrease production costs. But it wasn't working, and the board wanted to find out why. Who was at fault? Who was to blame? I was brought on by the company to help provide leadership guidance and executive coaching to the company's vice president of manufacturing. Although technically sound and experienced in this particular industry, the VP hadn't met the manufacturing goals set forth by the company's board of directors. His plan included the following: consolidate manufacturing plants to eliminate redundancy, increase worker productivity through an incentivized bonus program, and streamline the manufacturing process. The problem arose in the plan's execution. At each quarterly board meeting, the VP delivered a myriad of excuses as to why so little of his plan had been executed. After a year, the board wondered if he could effectively lead this change. With little progress to show, the VP's job was now at risk. I arrived on the scene 2 weeks before the next board meeting. After spending several hours with the CEO to get some color on the situation, I was introduced to the VP of manufacturing. My initial assessment was positive. The VP was extremely smart and incredibly knowledgeable about the business. But would he be open to coaching? "So, you're here to help me, right?" the VP inquired. Knowing that, due to ego, some people bristle at the idea of criticism and coaching, no matter how constructive, I chose to take a more indirect approach. "Maybe not so much here to help you, but here to help the situation," I answered, effectively lowering the VP's defenses. In the weeks leading up to the board meeting, I researched and examined the details of why the VP's plan had failed and what had gone wrong, and I spoke to the VP about the problems encountered in the plan's execution. He explained that the consolidation of manufacturing plants had failed because his distribution managers feared that increasing the distance between plants and distribution centers would prevent face-to-face interaction with the manufacturing team and reduce their ability to tweak order specifics. They surmised it would also inhibit their ability to handle rush order deliveries. The VP dismissed his distribution manager's concerns as unfounded. In the event the need rose to adjust orders or customize, a teleconference or video conference would more than suffice. The VP also explained why the incentivized bonus structure hadn't been put in place. Each time his plant managers and other key leaders were presented with the rollout plan, they pushed back with concerns. The employees wouldn't make enough money. They would leave their jobs for higher base salaries that didn't require minimum standards. Recruiters would capitalize on the change and pull skilled workers away. When the VP pushed the manufacturing managers harder, they teamed up with the sales managers. The two groups opposed the VP's plan, claiming it was the company's reputation for skilled manufacturing that kept business coming in, and such a change would put the business at risk. Finally, when it came to the VP's plan to streamline the manufacturing process, the pushback was universal and straight from the classic mantra of anti-change. We have always done it this way, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. What does the board think of these reasons? I asked as we discussed the upcoming annual board meeting. They listen, but I don't think they really understand them. And they've been hearing the same reasons for a while now, so I think they're getting frustrated. I don't know if they believe them anymore. They sound like excuses? I finished the sentence for the VP, knowing the word itself was a big blow to his ego. Yes, they sound like excuses. But these are real and legitimate, insisted the VP. Could there be other reasons your plan wasn't successfully executed? I asked. Absolutely, the VP answered. The market has been tough. New technology advancements have taken some time to work through. Everyone got focused on some products that never really amounted to much. So yes, there are a host of other reasons. Those all may be factors, but there's one most important reason why this plan has failed, I said. What reason is that? The VP inquired with interest. I paused for a moment to see if the VP was ready for what I had to tell him. The impact would be uncomfortable, but there was no way around it. I stated it plainly. You are the reason. The VP was surprised, then defensive. Me? He protested. I came up with a plan. I've delivered it over and over. It's not my fault they aren't executing it. I listened patiently. The plant managers, the distribution and sales teams don't fully support the plan. So how am I supposed to execute it? I'm not out there in the field with them. I can't make them listen to me. The VP's statements gradually became less emphatic. He soon realized what he was saying. He was making excuses. I explained that the direct responsibility of a leader included getting people to listen, support, and execute plans. To drive the point home, I told him, you can't make people listen to you. You can't make them execute. That might be a temporary solution for a simple task, but to implement real change, to drive people to accomplish something truly complex or difficult or dangerous, you can't make people do those things. You have to lead them. I did lead them, the VP protested. They just didn't execute. But he hadn't led them, at least not effectively. The measure of this was clear. He had been unsuccessful in implementing his plan. When I was in charge of a SEAL platoon or a SEAL task unit conducting combat operations, do you think every operation I led was a success? I asked. He shook his head. No. Absolutely not, I agreed. Sure, I led many operations that went well and accomplished the missions, but not always. I've been in charge of operations that went horribly wrong for a number of reasons. Bad intelligence, bad decisions by subordinate leadership, mistakes by shooters, coordinating units not following the plan. The list goes on. Combat is a dangerous, complex, dynamic situation where all kinds of things can go sideways in a hurry, with life and death consequences. There is no way to control every decision, every person, every occurrence that happens out there. It is just impossible. But let me tell you something. When things went wrong, you know who I blamed? I asked, pausing slightly for this to sink in. Me, I said. I blamed me. I continued. As the commander, everything that happened on the battlefield was my responsibility. Everything. If a supporting unit didn't do what we needed it to do, then I hadn't given clear instructions. If one of my machine gunners engaged targets outside his field of fire, then I had not ensured that he understood where his field of fire was. If the enemy surprised us and hit us where we hadn't expected, then I hadn't thought through all the possibilities. No matter what, I could never blame other people when a mission went wrong. The VP contemplated this. After a thoughtful silence, he responded, "I always thought I was a good leader. I've always been in leadership positions." That might be one of the issues. In your mind, you're doing everything right. So when things go wrong, instead of looking at yourself, you blame others. But no one is infallible. With extreme ownership, you must remove individual ego and personal agenda. It's all about the mission. How can you best get your team to most effectively execute the plan in order to accomplish the mission? I continued. That is the question you have to ask yourself. That is what extreme ownership is all about. The VP nodded, beginning to grasp the concept and see its effectiveness. Do you think every one of your employees is blatantly disobedient? I said. No, the VP said. If so, they would need to be fired. But that doesn't seem to be the situation here, I continued. Your people don't need to be fired. They need to be led. So what am I doing wrong as a leader? Asked the VP. How can I lead them? It all starts right here with you, I said. You must assume total ownership of the failure to implement your new plan. You are to blame. And that is exactly what you need to tell the board. Tell the board? Are you serious? The VP asked in disbelief. I don't mind taking a little blame, but this is not all my fault. Though beginning to see the light, he still resisted the idea of taking total responsibility. In order to execute this plan, in order to truly become an effective leader, you have to realize and accept total responsibility, I said. You have to own it. The VP was not yet convinced. If one of your manufacturing managers came to you and said, "My team is failing," what would your response be? Would you blame their team? I asked. No, the VP admitted. I explained that as the officer in charge of training for the West Coast SEAL teams, we put SEAL units through highly demanding scenarios to get them ready for combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. When SEAL leaders were placed in worst-case scenario training situations, it was almost always the leaders' attitudes that determined whether their SEAL units would ultimately succeed or fail. We knew how hard the training missions were because we had designed them. In virtually every case, the SEAL troops and platoons that didn't perform well had leaders who blamed everyone and everything else: their troops, their subordinate leaders, or the scenario. They blamed the SEAL training instructor staff, they blamed inadequate equipment or the experience level of their men. They refused to accept responsibility. Poor performance and mission failure were the result. The best performing SEAL units had leaders who accepted responsibility for everything. Every mistake, every failure or shortfall, those leaders would own it. During the debrief, after a training mission, those good SEAL leaders took ownership of failures, sought guidance on how to improve, and figured out a way to overcome challenges on the next iteration. The best leaders checked their egos, accepted blame, sought out constructive criticism, and took detailed notes for improvement. They exhibited extreme ownership, and as a result, their SEAL platoons and task units dominated. When a bad SEAL leader walked into a debrief and blamed everyone else, that attitude was picked up by subordinates and team members who then followed suit. They all blamed everyone else, and inevitably, the team was ineffective and unable to properly execute a plan. Continuing, I told the VP, in those situations, you ended up with a unit that never felt they were to blame for anything. All they did was make excuses and ultimately never made the adjustments necessary to fix the problems. Now, compare that to the commander who came in and took the blame. He said, "My subordinate leaders made bad calls. I must not have explained the overall intent well enough." Or, "The assault force didn't execute the way I envisioned. I need to make sure they better understand my intent and rehearse more thoroughly." The good leaders took ownership of the mistakes and shortfalls. That's the key difference. And how do you think their SEAL platoons and task units reacted to this type of leadership? They must have respected that, the VP acknowledged. Exactly. They see extreme ownership in their leaders, and as a result, they emulate extreme ownerships throughout the chain of command down to the most junior personnel. As a group, they try to figure out how to fix their problems, instead of trying to figure out who or what to blame. For those on the outside looking in, like our training group, or the board in your case, the difference is obvious. And that is how I appear to the board right now, blaming everyone and everything else, the VP recognized. There's only one way to fix it, I told him. For the next several days, I helped the VP prepare for the board meeting. At times, he slipped back into defensiveness, not wanting to accept the blame. He felt in many ways that his knowledge exceeded that of many members of the board, and he was probably right. But that didn't change the fact that he was the leader of a team that was failing its mission. As we rehearsed the VP's portion of the board presentation, I was unconvinced that he truly accepted total responsibility for his team's failures. I told him that bluntly. "I'm saying exactly what you told me to say," the VP retorted. "The reason that this mission was unsuccessful was my failure as a leader to force execution." "That's the problem," I said. "You're saying it, but I'm not convinced you believe it. Look at your career. You have accomplished amazing things, but you certainly aren't perfect. None of us are perfect. You are still learning and growing. We all are. And this is a lesson for you. If you re-engage on this task, if you do a stern self-assessment of how you lead and what you can do better, the outcome will be different. But it starts here. It starts at the board meeting when you go in, put your ego aside, and take ownership for the company's failure here. The board members will be impressed with what they see and hear, because most people are unable to do this. They will respect your extreme ownership. Take personal responsibility for the failures. You will come out the other side stronger than ever before," I concluded. At the board meeting, the VP did just that. He took the blame for the failure to meet manufacturing objectives and gave a solid, no-nonsense list of corrective measures that he would implement to ensure execution. The list started with what he was going to do differently, not about what other people needed to do. Now, the VP was on his way to extreme ownership.